morning. There's a story of a young boy sitting in a doctor's office in surgery, and the doctor's trying to explain to him that his young sister is seriously ill and they need to take some of his blood to give it to his sister to save her life. Will he do it? And the little boy is silent for a moment and pauses, and finally he says, yeah, okay, doc, I'll do it. So they go ahead with the procedure, and later, after everything's okay and settled down, the doctor goes to see the family or sitting in the waiting room, and then goes to the boy who's sitting by himself, and they talk a bit. And after a moment or two, the boy, who is very quiet, turns to the doctor and says, okay, doc, when do I die? And it was only then that the doctor realised that the little boy thought that in giving his blood, he was giving his life for his sister, that he was sacrificing himself to save his sister. That's what love is about. Love is about giving of self for another. It's not always that intense or that complete, but ultimately love is about the other, giving ourselves for another, for the well-being of another person or group or the common good. And this is what the message of Jesus has really been. Mark's story of Jesus that we've been following is really about how Jesus chooses love over everything else. How Jesus chooses the filter of love through which he determines what he should do, how he should live, how he should act. When someone's sick, he doesn't think of the laws and the rules that forbid him to touch them lest he become unclean. He responds to their need because that's what love dictates. When people come to him on the Sabbath day and it's against the law to heal or do good, Jesus heals. He doesn't say, come back tomorrow or next week when I can do it. When people are hungry, he looks ways to feed. When they're hungry for wisdom and love and life and grace and meaning and belonging, he responds. It's an active engagement in people's lives out of love. He doesn't look through the filters and the lenses of belief systems, political or religious ideologies that control people's lives, particularly the religious leaders. He doesn't look through the filters of what's right and wrong and black and white. He doesn't look through familial expectations, so the expectations of his family or his culture or his group or his village or his nation. He doesn't choose to look particularly at people's skin or ethnicity or disability or gender or sexuality or anything else. He reacts in love, and the lens and the filter through which he acts is love. And ultimately it's him acting in love that gives his life for this sake of God's realm, for the common good, for the well-being of all people, for the world, and to proclaim this love of God. In the story this week, in Mark 12, there's a bit before it that where Mark says all the religious leaders, all the groups of religious group leaders in Jerusalem are opposed to Jesus. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, whoever else. In some ways, he's trodden on their priorities. He's overturned their institutions and their ways of being, their religiosity, their polity, their rules, their laws, their belief systems. He's upset a lot of them. And he's challenged their power and authority and their lives and invited them into the way of love. He's challenged their power, and they don't like it. There's one scribe, though, we're told, listens to these interactions and likes what Jesus is saying, and he goes up to him and he says, look, teacher, tell me, what do you think is the foundational law, the great commandment, the greatest commandment, the thing that everything else hangs on? What is the law or the rule or the commandment that is fundamental, on which you can build everything else? And Jesus responds to him, well, you've heard it said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. That's the great commandment. But the second is like it. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. These two are what all the law, all the commandments are built on. This is the foundations, in other words. And the scribe says, well said, that's it. You know, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and your neighbour as yourself, that's more important than all the sacrifices and rituals and everything else, the burnt offerings that we require in our religious systems of the Jewish faith. And in fact, this is what much of the Old Testament points back to. How does God require us to live? With justice and love. I don't want your festivals and your sacrifices and your burnt offerings. I want your hearts reaching out in justice to one another, in love. That's what God wants. And that's what Jesus is on about. And that's what gets him offside with some of these authorities who want the power and the control and are locked into belief systems and rigid ways that tell you what you must do and what you must not do. But ultimately, when you base your actions in your life through the filters of belief systems and rituals and structures and so on, it leads to some kinds of violence. The violence of exclusion, of marginalisation, of rich and poor, of power imbalances. And I'd say that the way of love is contrast to the way of violence. In our world, there's all sorts of violence. There's economic injustice, where some nations and some people have lots of money and possessions and access to that, and many others have access to too little. They don't have enough to live, and that's wrong. It's unjust. It's evil. In our world with this pandemic, some nations have access to all the vaccines and some don't have enough, if any. That's wrong. It's not good for the world. It's not good for any of us. We need to learn how to share. There's the violence that happens in family systems where some people have power and strength and abuse the vulnerable or the weaker. There's domestic violence and abuse and other things. That's wrong. Families, just because it's a family, doesn't make it right. Just because it's a religious system doesn't make it right. For many of us, we act on our political ideologies or our religious ideologies or our other ideologies, and we follow sometimes blindly. As we saw in America earlier this year, in the Capitol, where people marched on the Capitol. Now, many of those people were good people, ordinary people, who were brainwashed, I suppose, into believing a particular way, and were called into action that was wrong. I mean, some were antisocial leaders and far-right organisations and troublemakers and antisocial groups. But many were ordinary people, and they're still acting up in that way. Many people we're seeing in our societies who, in the midst of a pandemic or post, as we come out of this restrictions and so forth, are saying, I don't care what the government says. I don't care what we're supposed to do. I'm going to do what's good for me. If I want to go into a place, I'll go there. And if I want a vaccine, I'll have it. If I don't want it, I won't. I won't wear a mask unless I really want to. I don't have to. No one can tell me. And then there's others who are saying, well, actually, it's not about me. It's about us. And if I can do something that makes the more vulnerable in our society safer, if I can do some things that keep all of us safe as possible, then I'll do it. Because that's the way of love. And that's what we're called to be and do. And that's what Jesus is inviting us into when he invites us to live in love, to love God with everything we are, our neighbour as ourselves. And it's not just limited to people, but to the earth. Because that's the world that God created and the world that God loves. And we're invited to love the world rather than abuse it and have it struggling and suffering the weight of human conquest. Love God with everything you are and love neighbour as yourself. And this call to love is not just a call to mushy, nice feelings. It's not about, romance and mushiness and niceness and all of that and feelings. It's not really about feelings. They're included and they're good. There's no problems with that. But it's about action. When I marry a couple, I don't ask them, do you love each other? I don't say, well, do you love each other? We assume that because they're here this day. They've gotten to this point and they love each other. What I ask them is, will you love each other? When life gets tough and hard, when you feel like it and you don't feel like it, when you feel good or bad or sad, or when life is challenging and throwing all sorts of obstacles your way, will you love each other? Will you look out for one another and seek the best for one another? That's the commitment of love. It's a doing, it's a living into the action of love, which may be associated with feelings and emotions, which are great, but it may not. It's committing ourselves to the other, committing ourselves to this way of God, which is about love, inclusion, embracing everybody into this commonwealth of God's reign, where everyone gets enough food, enough shelter, enough place to belong, enough inclusion, enough education, enough what they need to live and thrive and flourish. It's about the flourishing of communities and society and the world. That's the way of love. And that young boy in that story understood what love is and was willing to give his life for his sister. That's the way of love that Jesus talks about. That's the path of life. And we're invited to give of ourselves for the sake of the world. It's not an easy way, but it's the way into life. It's the way that Jesus invites us to live and to be. And he says that God is with us. Will you walk in this way? Journey with Jesus into the way of love? Amen.